Hello everyone and welcome back to MixBuzz TV mixing and mastering tutorials on YouTube. I'm your host David, and in this podcast I want to talk about a hot topic these days. Is analog gear dead? I decided to go ahead and talk about this knowing that will inevitably cause some controversy. The reason why I want to discuss whether or not analog gear is dead is because I feel like we are in what I'd call a transition phase. In regards of recording studios, studio gear in general, analog gear in particular, plugins, computers, and hard disk recording, and the way they changed both the music itself, how it's produced, how it's composed, the way it's recorded, mixed, and mastered. We saw many big names in the engineering world publicly stating how they went completely in the box. And this is old news for me, really. It doesn't surprise me one bit, as I've known many great engineers who have been in the box for a long time. What does surprise me are the reaction many die-hard analog gear lovers have. People who used to praise these pro engineers and probably bought the same pieces they used, now they talk so much shit about them because they, in their eyes, are lying when stating that you can work completely in the box. And a handful of what I feel are excuses are being used. The first one is, oh, they do it, mixing in the box, just for recalls, not for the sound. Or they are in the pocket of big plugins companies. Or, yes, but the material they mix has been recorded with tons of outboard gear. Disregarding completely the fact that these engineers stated that they feel like their work sound as good or better. Otherwise, they would keep using analog gear to mix. And it makes sense. It's not that they don't have it already. Of course, sometimes there are sponsorship involved, but I do feel those are pretty obvious and recognizable, so I won't talk about that here. I have analog gear and I don't use every piece I have every time, or I don't try to use as many analog compressor or EQs as possible on any mix just because. Sometimes I even prefer the sound of a given plugin instead of a piece of hardware. Sometimes everything is on and running, and some other times I stay completely in the box. And for the most part, these choices are made for the sound, not for convenience. I don't have like a 128 channels board to recall. I have a lot of hardware, but not so much that recalls take a whole day. But I said for the most part, because there are indeed cases in which efficiency and instant recall are a priority. And that's exactly the reason why a good modern engineer nowadays needs, let me stress this, needs to have his shit together and be able to deliver quality mixes in both environments. So what's up? Are plugins just as good or better than analog gear? Well, yes and no. Before digging the grave for hardware gear, here's my point of view. Total instant recall is a big advantage plugins have compared to hardware. It's undeniable. But not for the reasons many people think they do. It's not that we engineers are lazy fucks. Well, good ones definitely aren't. It's that clients today are used and expect dozens of little tweaks and revision of their work. Like, the guitar at 2 minutes, please, can you make it like 0.2 dB lower? Or that one snare hit over there, I'd like that a little louder. And so on. And it's not that the requests of the clients are crazy, it's that today with digital we have such degree of control over the mix that these changes would be impossible to do on an analog mix without changing something else too. Because no matter how precise you are at recalling your console or outboard gear, two analog mixes will never sound exactly the same. And nowadays this is hard to accept for the clients. Not all of them understand the workflow of analog mixing, and most important, none of them cares really. Because if you can't do what they ask, what they are used to, someone else will. On top of this, today we work on different projects at the same time. This is just the reality of the business, and that's also something that wasn't possible with analog gear, at least not without losing a stupid amount of time on recalls. But what about the sound? Many people swear that if you can't get a good sounding mix in the box is not your problem. And I agree for the most part, but that doesn't mean I am ready to declare analog is dead. I generally feel like plugins got better and better to the point that the endless hardware versus software, analog versus plugin debate just became silly and really, really old. We have to face reality. There are way less big analog studios nowadays, and many mixing engineers are mixing number one Billboard hits completely in the box or on hybrid systems. But those hybrid systems usually see few hardware pieces and a lot of in-the-box processing. The problem is that when talking about this subject, you usually hear two very different schools of thought. The ones that are very invested in hardware, big console, walls of gear, and so on, which will tell you plugin sucks and they are not even close to hardware. Or even if they're close, they can't deny that no more. They're not the same and they're still worse than mixing on analog. This point of view is obviously biased because, well, they have hundreds of thousands invested in gear and they are used to the workflow and the sound. The other point of view is biased as well. People who never had any experience with hardware or can't afford it, they only work with a laptop or a couple of computers in their bedrooms and they market themselves as engineers. This wouldn't be a problem if you mix your own stuff, but when you sell your services as a mixing engineer, you need at least to have a good room with good monitoring system. They are convinced and often try to convince others that hardware is old school, quotes. That the difference is not there anymore, even though they never worked in a proper studio with analog gear. As in many things, I do believe the truth is in the middle, which is where I stand, really. I'm fairly invested in hardware. I have racks of outboard gear. I love and buy hardware still, but I also sold a lot of it. Most of my processing is in the box, but there are some key units that I lean on for my mixes, not just for the sound, but also for workflow and consistency. This is mostly in regard to gain staging and overall balance, a whole different, too long to integrate it here story. So it happened many times that I had my 11176s on, ready to go, but I used plugins instead. Just because I truly believe there's no absolute better or worse, just different. And sometimes I need a piece of hardware, sometimes I prefer a plugin. We need and use both plugins and hardware. The thing is, plugin, I feel like saying, are able to do 80% of what hardware does, while there are things that plugins do that hardware simply can't. Now, I'd like to look at the matter from three different perspectives and split the making of a record in three phases: recording, mixing, and mastering. Let's start with recording. Tracking for me still goes to analog. If we talk about recording stuff and not 100% computer-generated sounds, but even if you use virtual instruments, I can assure you they will benefit from being run into some big-ass transformers most of the times. Here's where I feel hardware is still necessary. Good mics, good preamps. You just can't replace those. And the way I work, I like to print the sounds I record as close as possible to what I imagine them to sound in the record. And to do so, I often use compression and EQ on the way in. And I need hardware for that. I'm a compressor junkie, you know that if you follow the channel. And you know what? Because I do this for a living, there's something to say about the joy of using a piece of hardware. Let's face it, it's fun to have that tactile experience, to move a knob and change the sound. I enjoy personally the process of tweaking knobs and trying patching different units to make a sound almost mix ready. It's satisfying for me. And this is important not only for the sound, not only for the technical part. The closer the sound is to what you want it to sound, the less you'll have to process it when mixing time comes. But also because I do believe that if you enjoy your job, you simply perform better at it. So good mics, good preamps, analog compressor, and EQs are still irreplaceable for me for tracking. Plus, I like to commit to sounds, because one of the biggest pet peeve of mine is when people doesn't commit to the sound and leave way too many options open, like, oh, we'll decide later, or we'll fix it in the mix, or even worse in mastering. No, Too many options is, I feel, your worst enemy when mixing. Having too many options is like having none. I said that many times. Because you run the risk of taking way too much time to make the decision that you need to make and move on, which in turn will take away the focus and the concentration for what really matters for the mix, for the song you're mixing. So tracking, hardware is still needed for me. Mixing. Here's where things get hazy. We talked about recalls. Clients today are used to endless tweaks, often over extended period of time like days or weeks or months. And recalls are a problem even without a console. Let me tell you, even with just 20 pieces of outboard, recall is a bitch. But we all know that here is where In The Box has the edge, instant full recalls. What about the sound? Well, like I said before, in my opinion and the opinion of many professionals that switched to full In The Box, today plugins are no longer a bottleneck. Your skills, or lack of, are. Because if you can't deliver a top-notch number one track by mixing just with plugins, especially if it was tracked with nice gear to begin with, it's not the plugin's fault. With that said, I do believe that a well-chosen outboard collection does make a noticeable difference, and this is trickier to realize than it seems, because if you do an A/B test on one track, it will probably won't make you jump from the chair, although some piece of hardware do. But in a mix, let's say 8 to 16 key tracks or groups running through some nice pieces of gear can take your mix to the next level. This is the way I personally work. Can I mix completely in the box? Yes, I can. And if you pointed a gun to my head and let me choose between 100% in the box or 100% analog, and by that I mean no computer, I'd have no doubt and go in the box. So what are those key tracks or groups that can make a difference if processed with hardware? Well, I can tell you what a minimal analog setup looks for me, and that would be my groups or stems. So 2 bass, for sure, drums, bass, guitars, lead vocals, music, background vocals. So a minimal setup sees at least 6 to 8 stereo outputs going through analog compression and or EQ. I can get away with just that. A nice EQ and compressor on each, maybe a nice special processing unit with some variable saturation, and I'm good. Is analog gear absolutely necessary for mixing nowadays? To the point that you can't mix without it? No, I don't feel it is. It is nice to have the option? Yes, absolutely. Last phase, mastering. Here again, the answer is not black or white, really. Mastering, most important, necessary gear is, aside from the engineer's skills, taste, and experience, of course, the monitoring system, which includes the room. So in this regard, if we consider room and monitoring system gear, and we should, it is absolutely necessary. And of course, to even listen to what you're working on correctly, you need a high-end analog to digital, digital to analog converter. Given that, I feel like you can definitely master top albums in the box. Mastering should be primarily about being true to the mix and respect it, and of course smoothing out the differences between mixes in the context of an album. But if the mix is well done and balanced, and most important, it has the sound both the mixing engineer and the artist wanted, the mastering stage should be about respecting the mix. Enhance it if possible in the most transparent way. And if there's something plugins do very well, that is transparent. But there's something to say about hardware. Hardware can add that little fairy dust, that little magic, that nice final polish. But I'm afraid to say things like this because that little magic is really little. So a good mastering engineer working on a good mix, the difference between using that very expensive piece of gear or not would be at best 5%, because it's the engineer that makes the difference. And so if you can have it, is welcome for sure. But will it make or break the record? No, it won't. And I won't take into account the case of bad mixes that need to be mangled at mastering stage to try to get half decent sounding piece out of it, because first, that almost never ends well. Sure, the difference between mix and master will be a lot more obvious with a bad mix, but the end result will still be mediocre. And second, because here I feel plugins and hardware have it 50-50. Some trickery can be done only with plugins. Some euphonic fairy dust, let's call it, can only be done with hardware. Lastly, you know me, no bullshit allowed ever, so I will now say something most engineers won't. One of the reasons because we have and like hardware is the wow effect. That's just the truth. Racks full of gear are cool to look at, and they do make an impression on the clients. It's stupid, it's silly, but it's true. And so that is something that commercial studios do take into account. They have to. In conclusion, hardware is definitely not dead. It's necessary for tracking and in some ways also for mix and mastering. Mostly it's nice to have hardware if you can for two reasons. First, this is our job and we enjoy to use the tools we love. And second and most important, because plugins and analog are similar but not the same. When we say hardware versus plugins, in the box versus out of box, there's no versus. There's no war going on. Professionals need both and use both every day. Can you mix and master completely in the box if you have to and still achieve a professional sounding track? Yes, no doubt. And sometimes not only if you have, but some tracks actually benefit from 100% in the box mixing and mastering. In the end, it's really a matter of personal choice, experience, and we use what we are familiar with. So if you're mixing in the box because you started that way, don't feel crippled. Don't be ashamed and don't believe you can't achieve a professional result. And don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Talent, good ears, and experience will always trump gear, given you have the bare minimum, which is a room and a monitoring system that you can trust and translates well. And if you like to use hardware because you have it, keep doing that, but don't go around preaching how much better that is to everyone who doesn't have hardware, because I feel that's just a cheap way to try to attract clients that don't know better. And in the eyes of those who know, you're not doing yourself any favor pointing out that it's not your skills the reason why your mixes sound good, but the things you own. Watch that, because, well, everyone could buy the same gear, and there's always gonna be someone who has more than you do. So yeah, not a good idea. So this is it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as usual, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to click the like button, join us on Facebook and Twitter, support MixBuzz TV by sharing the videos on social media, Facebook groups, forums, blogs, subscribe if you haven't already, and see you next time.